Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit about theories of acids and bases. And up until this point, we really haven't talked about um, different types of acids or bases or different theories of acids and bases. We've just defined what an acid and what a base was. Well, there's actually three different theories out there of what an acid and what a base is. So here's kind of a flow chart to kind of illustrate how they all stack up. Now, it turns out there's some overlap. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. Um, so the first one we're going to talk about is this thing called an Arrhenius acid or base. And you'll see that that is probably the most narrow definition of acids and bases. And the other two definitions that we'll talk about, the Arrhenius definition fits into those other two definitions. So not all acids and bases are Arrhenius acids and bases, but later on, when you talk about something like a Lewis acids and a base, they'll fit nicely into that. So this is a flow chart trying to illustrate that. Um, all acids and bases are Lewis acids and bases, but not all acids and bases are Arrhenius acids and bases. Then again, you could probably say something along the lines that all Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases are or all Arrhenius acids and bases are Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases. You'd be able to say something like that. But this flowchart just tries to illustrate that this is like a nested hierarchy and they all kind of fit into each other rather than these are all separate entities. So again, Arrhenius fits into Bronsted-Lowry into Lewis acids. Bronsted-Lowry fits into Lewis acids, and then Lewis acids and bases, it encompasses everything that we could define as an acid or a base. So these are not all mutually exclusive definitions, and I just want to get that point across right now. So in previous lectures and discussions, we've talked about an acidic solution and a basic solution, and I've told you that an acidic solution is something that produces hydrogen ions in water, a high concentration of hydrogen ions in water. And this is an example of that. So here we have water and it's producing hydrogen ions, and there's a high concentration of hydrogen ions and a low concentration of hydroxide ions. Likewise, we have a basic solution, and here's the basic solution, and it's producing a low concentration of hydrogen ions and a high concentration of hydroxide ions. Now, we have lots of scenarios that this can occur, and we did some example problems where you identified an acid and a base. But this is basically what you identified as acids or bases, and this was a good introduction to acids and bases. Turns out there's three definitions of acids and bases, and I gave you the most basic definition I possibly could of an acid or a base. All right, so our first definition is something called the Arrhenius definition of an acid or a base. And the Arrhenius definition of an acid or a base is basically what we have been talking about. An Arrhenius acid involves the increase in the amount of hydrogen ions in water. And the Arrhenius base is the increase of the amount of hydroxide ions in water. Now, if we go back to that same slide, we just saw that. Here's the two slides that you've been familiar with. Here we have water giving up a hydrogen ion, and that's an acidic solution. And here we have water giving up hydroxide ions, and that's a basic solution. So this isn't anything different than you've already seen so far. Now, there is a special note that you have to make sure of when you're dealing with an Arrhenius acid or base. The solvent, again, the thing doing the dissolving, must be water. And that's very important for this definition to take place. And if you don't have a solvent of water, it doesn't work. So let's do a practice problem. And this is a practice problem that we've already done in class. But let's go ahead and do it again. So here we have HCl, and this HCl breaks into H plus and Cl minus. And again, we're going to assume that we are using water to do our dissolving. So here we have some HCl, and it goes into water. Now this is the same practice problem we did in the previous problems, and we've done this in class, obviously. But which is the solute, which is the solvent? Well, the solute is the HCl, and the solvent is the water. And so, again, we have water, so our Arrhenius definition makes sense. And what happens to HCl in water? Well, it does something called disassociates. And so sometimes you'll see a definition that talks about this, and it says disassociation. And so it talks about disassociation in water. And that's what makes sense. So we have a dissociation in water. Cl separates and H plus separates. So this would make sense under the Arrhenius definition of an acid because we have H plus ions being donated. So this would be an acidic solution under the Arrhenius definition. Let me go back to that slide real quick. So this again would be an acidic solution because it's donating hydrogen ions in solution within water. So this could be an Arrhenius acid. In a like manner, we have NaOH, and this is donating sodium ions and hydroxide ions, and again, we're using the solvent water. And so this would fit the Arrhenius definition, and this is what happens in water. These are the same examples that I have been giving you, and I've been using this definition for the most part as acids or bases. So in water, again, we get hydroxide ions, and this is again in water, and so this would be a base. Now let me show you why water is so important for this Arrhenius definition. What makes it Arrhenius? Well, we have hydrogen ions and we have H2O, and if we don't have H2O, we have a problem. Now, some of you were asking me about this, but we have this thing called a hydronium ion. And I told you before that there's this thing called a hydronium ion and a thing called H+, and both of those really were kind of very similar to each other. Now what happens is you have H+, which is really just a proton, and it goes and associates itself in water with an H2O molecule. And when it does that, it forms this thing called a hydronium ion, an H3O+. And that's what makes this Arrhenius, and that's the term for it. So this is what it means to be an Arrhenius acid. Again, to make it an Arrhenius base, it just has to produce hydroxide. So that's one form or one definition of an acid. Let's move on to the next definition of an acid or a base. So this definition didn't fit the bill for everything. There are substances out there that have acidic properties or basic properties, and they didn't really, they don't have to be in water. So what happened is we had to develop another definition to define an acid or a base that didn't involve water. And we did that with the Bronston-Lowry acids and base definition. Now, a Bronston-Lowry acid is a little bit different. It involves molecules that can donate a hydrogen ion. It sounds very similar, and it is. And a Bronston-Lowry base it's a molecule that can accept a hydroxide ion. And let me show you what I mean by that. It's going to look very similar, but we're also dealing with this thing called a conjugate acid-base pair. So here we have an equation, and we're going to form something called a conjugate acid-base pair. All right, so what I've done is I've kind of labeled these with arrows so you can kind of see where the conjugate acids and bases will form. On each side of the equation, you're going to have an acid and a base. That's just kind of how this works with a conjugate acid-base pair. In Bronston-Lowry definitions, you generally have an acid and a base on either side of the equation. One's giving up a hydrogen ion, one's accepting a hydrogen ion. And that's just the definition of how this works. One's giving up a hydrogen ion and one's accepting a hydrogen ion. Now, if you look at the far left, you see H2CO3. And you look at the other yellow arrow, you see HCO3. These two differ only by one hydrogen ion. One hydrogen ion. That's the only difference that we have right here. The loss of one hydrogen ion. So if you pull out one hydrogen ion, from that H2CO3, that's the only difference that we have between these two substances on both sides of the equation. So according to our definition, molecules that can donate a hydrogen ion we call an acid. And so that would be our first H2CO3. And molecules that can accept a hydrogen ion, we can call a base, which would be HCO3. So here we have an acid, and here we have an or here we have a base. So one's donated a hydrogen ion, and one's accepted a hydrogen ion. So this forms this thing called a conjugate, or an acid-base conjugate acid-base pair. We can do that again. We can do that again with other members of, or the OH and the H2O. Again, these also differ by an H plus. So we have OH minus and H2O. Again, those differ between H plus. So we had a loss of an H plus here, and then we had a gain of an H plus from OH minus to H2O. So again, the loss of an H plus indicates that the OH minus is a base, and the gain indicates that the H2O is an acid. So that's an example of the Bronsted-Lowry definition. It's based upon whether or not something can accept or donate an H plus ion. All right, so that's two definitions of acids and bases. Let's get to the third and final definition of acids and bases. And this is called Lewis acids and Lewis bases. Okay, so this goes back to the idea of Lewis structure. And you probably remember Lewis structure, that's when we were drawing out the lines and the dots. And we were counting out electrons. Well, that's very similar with what we're doing with Lewis acids and Lewis bases. Lewis acids, these are compounds that can accept an electron pair from a donor compound. Now, it's important to remember that it has to be a pair of electrons, two electrons together. And if it accepts those pair of electrons, we call it a Lewis acid. A Lewis base, on the other hand, will donate an electron pair to another compound. So this is a big, broad definition because it encompasses more substances than either of the other two definitions ever would. Let's look at an example. So here's an example. We have NH3 plus H plus, and it goes to NH4 plus. This example doesn't make a lot of sense until you draw everything out using Lewis structure. So here I've drawn everything out using Lewis structure. And you can see that first we have NH3 plus. And so you have three hydrogens, a nitrogen, and then you have two lone pair electrons. These lone pair electrons, this is the pair that's going to get donated. Next we have an H plus. Now this H plus is also called a proton. Now notice the plus. The plus means that we're missing an electron. So what can happen is this H plus can accept a pair of electrons. So what's going to happen is this H plus is going to accept the pair of electrons. Now when it does that, the H plus could become the acid, and the NH3 is going to become the base. Again, here's the definition of Lewis acids and Lewis bases. A Lewis acid is a compound that can accept an electron pair from a donor compound, and a Lewis base is a compound that can donate an electron pair to another compound. So again, look at the one that's doing the donating. That's the NH3 plus, the NH3. It's donating a pair of electrons to the H plus. The H plus is accepting them. And so when you do that, you get a base and an acid. And this is the definition of a Lewis base and a Lewis acid. Now, also look at this from a different perspective. If you were looking at this from our general perspective of acids and bases, the H plus, you probably would say was an acid. So there is some overlap in what these definitions are, but this is definitely a Lewis acid and a Lewis base. Now, in case you want to see what these look like animated, this is what it looks like animated. Okay, in summary, again, this is that flow chart that overlaps all of the different theories of acids and bases. Again, they are not exclusive. They overlap with one another, so it's kind of a nested hierarchy. Lewis acids and bases, that's all acids and bases. It encompasses Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases, which encompasses um, Arrhenius acids and bases. So, I know that sounded confusing. You can go back and rewatch the video. I hope that made some sense. Um, let's go back over the definitions. Again, an Arrhenius acid and base. This is the one that we started off with. It increases the amount of hydrogen ions in water, and an Arrhenius base increases the amount of hydroxide ions in water. This is the one that we started out with inside of our class. That doesn't work for all of chemistry application. So chemists developed the Bronsted-Lowry acids and base concept, and this is the one that you have a conjugate acid-base pair, and this is where molecules can donate a hydrogen ion, and molecules will accept a hydroxide ion. So there's a donation of a hydrogen ion and them accepting a hydroxide ion. And finally, we have Lewis acids and bases, and this is where a pair of electrons are donated or accepted. So this concludes theories of acids and bases. Good luck. Feel free to ask your teacher for help.